I stepped off the transport helicopter onto the icy landing pad, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. The wind cut through my standard-issue military parka despite its thickness, and I had to squint against the swirling snow. Arctic Research Station Delta 7 stood before me, a cluster of low, rectangular buildings connected by covered walkways, all painted bright orange against the endless white landscape. The helicopter lifted off behind me, its rotor wash creating a temporary blizzard. I grabbed my duffel bag and trudged toward the main entrance where a figure waited, arms crossed against the cold. "Sergeant Dennis Barry reporting for duty, ma'am," I said, standing at attention as best I could while balancing my bag. Commander Florence Hamilton nodded curtly. She was shorter than me but carried herself with unmistakable authority. Her salt and pepper hair was cut in a practical bob that framed a face weathered by years in harsh conditions. "At ease, Sergeant. Let's get you inside before you freeze solid." The main door closed behind us with a heavy thunk, sealing out the howling wind. The interior was utilitarian but warm, a welcome change from the biting cold outside. The walls were lined with equipment lockers, safety notices, and topographical maps of the surrounding area. "This way to my office," Commander Hamilton said, not waiting to see if I followed. Her office was small but organized, with a desk covered in neatly arranged papers and a large monitor displaying weather patterns. She motioned for me to sit while she pulled a file from a drawer. "Your record is impressive, Sergeant. 8 years of service, specialized training in cold weather operations, excellent evaluations from your previous commanding officers." "Thank you, ma'am." She closed the file and leaned forward. "Let me be clear about something. This isn't a typical posting. The Arctic is unforgiving in ways that go beyond the cold. We maintain strict protocols here for everyone's safety." She opened another drawer and pulled out a laminated card, sliding it across the desk to me. "These are our 5 rules. Memorize them. Follow them without exception." I picked up the card and read, "Rule 1. Never leave the outpost alone. Rule 2. Never open for anyone knocking. Rule 3. Maintain radio contact at all times during exterior operations. Rule 4. Do not approach figures who shouldn't be there. Rule 5. Do not look out windows after midnight." I looked up, wondering if this was some kind of joke. "Ma'am, may I ask the reasoning behind these rules?" "They've kept us alive, Sergeant. That's all you need to know for now." She stood up. "Let's introduce you to the rest of the team." We walked through a series of corridors until we reached what appeared to be a common area with a small kitchen, a table, and some chairs. 2 men sat playing cards. "Gentlemen," Commander Hamilton called, "meet your new team member, Sergeant Dennis Barry." The stockier of the 2 jumped up with a wide grin. "Well, hot damn. Fresh meat." He extended his hand. "Corporal Nolan Banks, at your service. Don't mind the commander's scary face. She's actually a teddy bear once you get past the grisly exterior." Commander Hamilton rolled her eyes, but didn't contradict him. The second man stood more slowly. He was taller and leaner, with light brown hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. "Private Jackson George," he said quietly, briefly shaking my hand before letting go. "I'll leave you to get acquainted," Commander Hamilton said. "Banks, show Barry to his quarters and get him oriented on the daily schedule. I expect him fully operational by tomorrow morning." After she left, Nolan slapped me on the back. "Come on, I'll give you the grand tour of our frozen paradise." As we walked, Nolan kept up a steady stream of chatter in his Texan drawl, pointing out different areas of the station. "This here's the communications room. Gotta check in with HQ twice daily. That's the equipment bay. We maintain snowmobiles and other vehicles there. Kitchen's fully stocked. We rotate cooking duties, and here's where you'll be bunking." The room was small but functional. A bed, a desk, a locker, and a small window looking out onto the endless white landscape. "Not exactly the Hilton, but it keeps the cold out," Nolan said. Dinner's at 1800. Don't be late. Jackson's cooking tonight, and while he ain't much for conversation, the man can make a mean chili. The first week passed in a blur of training and orientation. I learned the station's monitoring systems, practiced equipment checks, and studied weather pattern recognition. The work was straightforward but crucial. We tracked atmospheric conditions, maintained the facility, and reported data back to military headquarters. Nolan was always ready with a joke or story, making even the most mundane tasks entertaining. Jackson remained quiet, speaking only when necessary, though I noticed his keen attention to detail during our shared duties. On my 5th night, Nolan and I were checking equipment in the storage bay when he suddenly turned serious. "You getting used to this place yet?" he asked, his usual smile fading. "I think so. The routines are pretty straightforward." He nodded slowly. "Just remember something. The Arctic plays tricks on people's minds." "What do you mean?" "The isolation, the constant darkness in winter, the endless white, it messes with your head. People start seeing things, hearing things that ain't really there." I raised an eyebrow. "Is this your way of hazing the new guy?" His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe a little, but I'm also serious. Ask Jackson if you don't believe me." I laughed it off. "I've been through desert deployments where guys hallucinated from heat exhaustion. I think I can handle a little snow blindness." "Sure thing, tough guy," Nolan said, his usual cheerful tone returning. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." I dismissed his warning as typical veteran-to-newcomer teasing, the kind designed to keep rookies on edge. But on day 8, everything changed. Nolan and I were performing exterior checks on the weather monitoring equipment. The sky had been clear when we started, but Arctic weather was notoriously unpredictable. Within 20 minutes, the wind picked up dramatically, and snow began falling heavily. "We should head back," I called over the increasingly loud wind. Nolan nodded, but then froze, staring past me into the swirling snow. "You see that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tense. I turned to look where he was pointing, but saw nothing except white. "See what?" "There's someone out there," he said, taking a step forward. "That's impossible. It's just the snow playing tricks on your eyes." The wind howled louder, visibility dropping by the second. We were quickly being enveloped in a whiteout. "No, I saw someone walking away from the station," Nolan insisted, taking another step forward. I grabbed his arm. "We need to get back now. The storm's getting worse." He shook off my hand. "What if someone's lost out there?" "There's no one else out here, Nolan. We're the only team for 100 miles. But he wasn't listening anymore. He took another step forward, then another. "Nolan, stop!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. He started moving faster, heading away from the station. "Banks, that's an order!" I yelled as loudly as I could. For a moment, he paused and looked back at me, snow collecting on his eyelashes. "I'll be right back. Just gonna check it out." Then he turned and ran into the whiteout, quickly disappearing from view. I stood there for a moment, torn between following him and following protocol. Rule 1 was clear: never leave the outpost alone. If I chased after him, we might both end up lost. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I turned and made my way back to the station, using the guide rope we had set up earlier. I burst through the door, immediately reporting to Commander Hamilton what had happened. She mobilized immediately, ordering Jackson to prepare the emergency equipment while she contacted headquarters. The storm raged for hours, making any search impossible. We could only wait, monitoring the radio for any transmission from Nolan. None came. When the storm finally cleared the next morning, we organized search parties, sweeping outward from the station in a grid pattern. I led one team while Commander Hamilton led another. We called Nolan's name until our voices grew hoarse, following standard search and rescue protocols. But we found nothing. No tracks, no equipment, no sign that Corporal Nolan Banks had ever existed outside the walls of our station. He had vanished completely, leaving us with only questions and the howling Arctic wind. I spent the next 2 days trudging through snow with the search parties, Commander Bradley led most of them herself, dividing us into teams that worked in grid patterns extending outward from the station. The visibility had improved since the storm, but the landscape offered nothing but endless white in every direction. No tracks, no equipment, no sign that Nolan Banks had ever existed beyond 50 yards from the outpost. "This doesn't make sense," I said during our third sweep, my voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around my face. He couldn't have gotten far in that weather. Commander Bradley stopped walking and turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable behind her snow goggles, but her posture had stiffened. "This is why we have rules, Barry," she said. Her tone wasn't angry, just matter of fact. "Rule 1 exists for a reason. Never leave the outpost alone." I nodded, though the explanation didn't satisfy me. People didn't just vanish without a trace, even in Arctic conditions. There should have been something, a glove, a footprint, a sign of struggle against the elements. When we returned to the station that evening, I found Jackson sitting alone in the common area, staring at the wall. He barely acknowledged me when I entered. "No luck?" he asked after several seconds. "Nothing," I replied, removing my outer gear and hanging it by the door. "It's like he was never out there." Jackson nodded slowly. "That's how it goes." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I headed to the kitchen to make us both some coffee. The search would continue tomorrow, but I was already beginning to accept what Commander Bradley seemed to know from the start. We weren't going to find Nolan Banks. By the third day, headquarters ordered us to end the search. The official report listed Banks as missing, presumed dead due to extreme weather conditions. Life at the station was expected to continue as normal until a replacement arrived. 3 nights later, I was on watch duty in the communications room. The digital clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. Commander Bradley and Jackson had both turned in hours ago, leaving me alone with the steady hum of equipment and occasional static from the radio. I was updating the hourly log when I heard it. A knocking at the main entrance. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I froze, pen hovering above the paper. The station was miles from anywhere. No one should be outside at this hour, in these temperatures. The knocking came again, 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced. I stood up and moved toward the main corridor, stopping. To grab the flashlight from the desk. The knocking continued. 3 raps, pause, 3 more, as I made my way down the hallway. The sound echoed through the empty space, somehow both muffled and clear at the same time. As I approached the entrance, a voice called out from the other side of the door. "Hey, is anyone in there? It's freezing out here." I stopped cold. The voice was unmistakable. The same Texan drawl, the same casual inflection. It was Nolan Banks. "Dennis, that you moving around in there? Come on, man, open up." I got lost in the storm, but I found my way back. My hand moved toward the lock mechanism. It made no sense, but it was him. It was Nolan's voice, clear as day. "Dennis!" I jumped at the sound of Jackson's voice behind me. He stood at the end of the hallway in his standard-issue gray t-shirt and sweatpants, eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing?" he asked, moving quickly toward me. "It's Banks," I said, gesturing toward the door. "He's out there." Jackson reached me just as my fingers touched the lock. He grabbed my arm and pulled it away. "Rule 2, he said quietly, pointing to the wall where Commander Bradley had posted the laminated card with the 5 rules. "Never open for anyone knocking." "But it's Banks," I argued, though I allowed Jackson to pull me back a few steps. "Listen to him. Please, guys." The voice outside grew more desperate. "I can see the lights on. I know you're in there. My hands are freezing. I can't feel my toes anymore." Jackson's grip on my arm tightened. "We need to get Bradley." "There's no time," I said. "He could freeze to death out there." "Dennis, buddy," the voice called again. "It's me, Nolan. I got turned around in the storm, but I'm back now. Just open the door." I looked at Jackson, whose face had gone completely pale. "We can't just leave him out there." "Think about it," Jackson whispered. "Really think. The search parties found nothing. Not a trace. How could he have survived 3 days out there? The temperatures at night dropped to -60. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Guys, please, I'm dying out here." I hesitated, torn between protocol and what seemed like the obvious humanitarian choice. Jackson used my moment of indecision to pull me further from the door, back toward the communications room. "The rules keep us alive," he said. His voice was shaking. "That's what Bradley always says." For the next hour, we sat in the communications room, listening as the voice that sounded exactly like Nolan Banks cycled through pleas, reasoning, and eventually anger. "I thought we were friends, Dennis. How can you leave me out here? I'd never do this to you. This is inhumane. You're going to let me die out here? Open the goddamn door. I know you can hear me." As I listened, something began to bother me. Despite all his desperate pleas and accusations, the voice never mentioned anything personal, nothing about Texas, his family, or any of the stories he'd shared during our short time together. Nothing about our conversation in the storage bay about Arctic hallucinations. Nothing that only the real Nolan Banks would know. Eventually, the voice fell silent. Jackson and I sat without speaking until Commander Bradley found us there at 5 a.m., still staring at the radio equipment, though neither of us had touched it for hours. When we told her what happened, she simply nodded and instructed us to note it in the log. She didn't seem surprised. "Check outside," she ordered. "Full daylight only." When morning came, I suited up and stepped outside with Jackson. The sun was barely over the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. We examined the area around the entrance carefully. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been at the door. The pristine snow lay undisturbed in every direction. "I don't understand," I said, crouching down to look more closely at the ground beneath the entry. "He was here. We both heard him." Jackson said nothing, just stared out at the empty white landscape with those pale blue eyes of his. A week passed without further incident. The station fell into a quiet rhythm, just the three of us maintaining the systems, running the tests, sending reports. Then the transport helicopter arrived with our new team member. Sergeant Jasper Robertson stepped off the helicopter with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was about my height with black hair cut precisely to regulation length and an athletic build. He greeted Commander Bradley with a crisp salute before being escorted inside. During his orientation, I noticed Robertson's eyes narrow when Bradley presented him with the laminated card of rules. He accepted it with a polite, "Yes, ma'am." But there was something in his expression, a slight curl at the corner of his mouth, a dismissive glance at the card before pocketing it. Later, as I showed him the equipment bay, he asked, "So, what's with all these rules? Bit excessive for a research station, isn't it?" "They keep us alive," I repeated Bradley's words, feeling their weight. "Especially Rule 1 and 2. "Right," he said, nodding with exaggerated seriousness. "Never leave alone, never open for knocking. Very spooky." He chuckled. "Military loves its protocols, huh? Even in the middle of nowhere." I stopped checking inventory and turned to face him directly. Banks thought it was funny too. Now he's gone. Robertson's smile faded slightly, but the skepticism remained in his eyes. "Look, I'm sorry about what happened to your friend, but people get lost in Arctic conditions all the time. It's not some mystery that needs rules written on a card." I didn't argue. There was no way to explain what we'd heard that night. The voice that was Nolan's, but somehow not Nolan's, without sounding crazy. Instead, I finished showing him around the station and left him to settle into Banks's old quarters. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Robertson's reaction to the rules. His skepticism reminded me of my own initial response. reasonable doubt from a rational mind. But after what had happened with Banks, after hearing that voice at the door, I knew better now. The rules weren't suggestions or overcautious guidelines. They were survival. I kept a close eye on Jasper during our first patrol together. The weather had cleared enough to perform routine maintenance on the exterior sensors. Nothing complicated, just standard checks to make sure the equipment hadn't been damaged in the recent storm. We trudged through the snow in full cold weather gear, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Radio check, Robertson," I said as we approached the first sensor array about 50 yards from the main entrance. Jasper nodded but didn't respond verbally. I watched as he reached down to his belt and switched his radio completely off. "What are you doing?" I asked, pointing at his radio. "Rule 3. We need to maintain radio contact during all exterior operations." He looked at me with that same dismissive expression he'd worn when Commander Bradley had given him the rules card. "Come on, Barry. We're literally 20 steps from the door. Who are we going to call? Each other?" "That's not the point," I said. "The rules are there for a reason. Yeah, to keep us in line with unnecessary protocols." He turned away and continued walking toward the sensor array. "I'll turn it back on if we go further out." I wanted to argue more, but decided it wasn't worth escalating the situation. We were close to the station, and I could still see Commander Bradley through the main window monitoring our progress. I'd mention it to her later. The maintenance itself was straightforward, checking connections, clearing snow buildup, and confirming power levels. Jasper worked efficiently but remained unusually quiet. When we finished and headed back inside, I noticed something had changed in his demeanor. The cocky skepticism was gone, replaced by a distant stare. "Everything okay?" I asked as we removed our gear in the equipment bay. He looked at me with a slight delay, like my words had to travel a great distance to reach him. "Fine," he said finally. "Just cold." During dinner that evening, Jasper barely touched his food. He kept glancing toward the windows, though they were covered as required after dark. When I tried to engage him in conversation about his previous assignments, he gave only one-word answers, his attention clearly elsewhere. "You feeling all right, Robertson?" Commander Bradley asked, noticing his behavior. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Later, I found Jackson in the communications room and mentioned what had happened. "He switched off his radio?" Jackson asked, his pale blue eyes widening slightly. "Yeah. Didn't seem to think it was a big deal." Jackson shook his head. "Banks said the same thing before." He trailed off, not finishing the thought. The next morning, Jasper joined us for breakfast, but ate nothing. He sat staring at the wall, responding to questions only after we repeated them multiple times. When Bradley assigned him to check inventory in the storage bay, he nodded mechanically and left. "Something's not right with him," I told Bradley once Jasper was out of earshot. "Keep an eye on him," she replied, "but don't leave him alone outside the station." Over the next few days, Jasper's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Jackson pointed out that Jasper had stopped eating with us altogether, grabbing food at odd hours when no one else was around. I also noticed his bunk appeared untouched most mornings, as if he hadn't slept there. "He spends a lot of time in the storage bay," Jackson told me on the 4th night. "I found him just standing there in the dark yesterday." "Did he say anything?" "No, just looked at me and walked away." On the 5th morning, Bradley assigned Jasper and me to perform a routine equipment check. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. After checking the common areas, kitchen, and communications room, I reported to Bradley that I couldn't find him. "Check the exterior door log," she ordered, her expression grim. The log showed the main door had been opened at 4:23 a.m. A quick search of the equipment bay revealed Jasper's cold weather gear was still in place, but his radio lay on the floor, switched off. Bradley organized an immediate search party, following the same protocols we'd used when Banks disappeared. We found nothing, No footprints beyond 20 yards from the station, no equipment, no sign that Jasper Robertson had ever walked away from the outpost. He had simply vanished, leaving only his silent radio behind. For the next 2 weeks, Jackson, Bradley, and I maintained the station operations with just the three of us. The incident had removed any trace of skepticism I might have still harbored about the rules. We followed them with religious dedication, radios always on during exterior work, never venturing out alone, windows covered after dark, and ignoring the occasional knocking that sometimes came in the dead of night. Jackson had become even more withdrawn, checking locks obsessively and jumping at unexpected noises. Bradley maintained her professional demeanor, but I noticed the strain in her eyes during our daily briefings. Exactly 15 days after Jasper's disappearance, Bradley and I conducted a daylight perimeter check to ensure all exterior equipment was functioning properly. We had split up but remained within visual contact of each other and the station, our radios crackling with regular check-ins. I was examining the western sensor array when movement caught my eye. Looking up, I spotted a figure standing about 100 yards away on a small ridge. My breath caught as I recognized the stocky build and the way he held his shoulders. It was Nolan Banks. He raised his arm and waved at me, the gesture almost friendly. "Barry, status check." Bradley's voice came through the radio. I hesitated, my hand halfway to the radio button. Banks was waving again, now beckoning me to come closer. "Barry, do you copy?" Bradley's voice had an edge of concern. I pressed the button. "I copy. Commander, I see someone on the western ridge. It looks like Banks." A long pause. "Remember Rule 4. Do not approach figures who shouldn't be there." "But what if—" "That's an order, Corporal. Stay in position. I'm coming to you." I stood frozen, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the figure. Banks had been my friend. If by some miracle he'd survived. I raised the binoculars hanging around my neck and focused on the figure. At first glance, it was undeniably Banks. The same face, same build, same cold weather gear he'd been wearing when he disappeared into the storm. But as I adjusted the focus, I noticed something wrong. His proportions were slightly off, like his arms were too long for his body. His face, while recognizable, had a strange flatness to it, as if someone had tried to draw Banks from memory, but missed crucial details. I lowered the binoculars, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. The figure remained perfectly still now, no longer waving, just standing there, watching me. Bradley appeared at my side, her own binoculars raised. "How long has it been there?" "About 5 minutes," I said. "It looks like Banks, but it's not," she finished for me. "Let's get back to the station, now." "Shouldn't we investigate? What if it's some kind of search party?" Bradley lowered her binoculars and fixed me with a hard stare. "Rule 4 exists for a reason, Barry. We're heading back. That's an order." We returned to the station, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. An hour later, I checked through the observation window with the station's high-powered telescope. The figure was still there, in exactly the same position, completely motionless despite the bitter wind and cold. "Has it moved at all?" Jackson asked, joining me at the window. "Not an inch," I replied. We took turns watching throughout the afternoon. The figure of Banks remained perfectly still, like a statue planted in the snow. Then, as the sun began to set and visibility started to fade, I took one final look through the telescope. The ridge was empty. The figure had vanished completely, leaving no tracks or disturbance in the snow-covered landscape. I was checking the connections on the western sensor array when I noticed Jackson walking toward me across the snow. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale. Something about the way he moved, quick, jerky steps, told me something was wrong before he even opened his mouth. "Dennis," he said, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you." I straightened up from the sensor panel. "What's going on?" Jackson glanced back at the station, then leaned in closer. I broke Rule 5 last night. His eyes were bloodshot with dark circles underneath. I looked out the window after midnight. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut. After everything that had happened with Banks and Robertson, I couldn't believe he'd risk breaking one of the rules. "Why would you do that?" I asked, keeping my voice low even though we were alone out here. I heard something, tapping on the glass. He ran a hand through his hair. I thought maybe it was just ice or snow falling, but it kept happening in this pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. The same pattern we'd heard at the door that night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. So I pulled back the cover, just a little bit, Jackson continued. Just enough to see. "What did you see?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "People, Dennis, standing around the outpost. All of them." His voice cracked. Banks was there, and Robertson, and others I didn't recognize. They were just standing there, looking up at the windows. Some of them were making these gestures like they wanted me to come outside. I grabbed his arm. "Did you tell Bradley?" Jackson shook his head. "Not yet. I don't know what to say. How do I explain what I saw?" "We need to report this," I insisted. "Whatever's happening here, we need to stick together and follow protocols." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. His eyes kept darting around, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see those figures materialize in broad daylight. Over the next 3 days, Jackson's condition got worse. I'd find him checking the locks on doors and windows multiple times per hour. During meals, he barely ate, just pushed food around his plate while mumbling to himself. At night, I'd hear him pacing in his quarters. Bradley noticed too. She pulled me aside after Jackson skipped a scheduled equipment check. "What's going on with George?" she asked. I told her what Jackson had shared with me about breaking Rule 5 and what he claimed to have seen. She listened without interrupting, her face giving away nothing. "Keep an eye on him," she said finally, "and make sure he understands the importance of following the rules." But it was already too late. That evening, I found Jackson in the communications room, his ear pressed against the wall. "They're in there," he whispered when he saw me. "In the walls. Can't you hear them?" I couldn't hear anything except the constant hum of the heating system. "Jackson, there's nothing in the walls," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's get you something to eat, okay?" He shook his head violently. "They're talking to me, Dennis. They know my name. They know things about me no one else knows." I managed to get him back to his quarters, but he refused to sleep. He just sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the covered window. "Don't look out there," I reminded him. "Remember Rule 5. "It doesn't matter," he said flatly. "They know I've seen them now." The next morning, I woke to the sound of Bradley pounding on my door. "Barry, get up!" I stumbled out of bed, pulled on my pants, and opened the door. "Jackson's gone," she said. "We checked every room in the station. No sign of him. His cold weather gear was still hanging in the equipment bay, but his boots were missing." The main door was ajar, letting in a stream of frigid air. Bradley and I suited up and followed the footprints leading away from the station. They were clearly Jackson's. I recognized the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel from our previous patrols together. But about 50 yards out, the tracks simply stopped. Not covered by fresh snow or blown away by wind. They just ended, as if Jackson had been plucked from the ground mid-step. Bradley insisted we continue searching in a grid pattern, just as we had for Banks and Robertson. But I already knew we wouldn't find him. With Jackson gone, I was the only one left besides Bradley. And then, 3 days later, she received orders for immediate evacuation due to a medical emergency in her family. The transport arrived within hours, leaving me alone at the station until replacements could be sent. "Follow the rules," Bradley told me before boarding the helicopter. "No exceptions." Replacements should arrive within 6 weeks. And so began my solitary watch at Arctic Research Station Delta 7. I followed the rules religiously. Rule 1: never leave the outpost alone. That was easy enough. I had no reason to go outside except for essential maintenance, which I postponed until help arrived. Rule 2: never open for knocking. This proved harder than I expected. The knocking started the very first night after Bradley left. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Then a voice, Banks at first, then Robertson, then Jackson. Sometimes all 3 at once, their voices overlapping as they called my name. "Dennis, please. It's freezing out here. Let me in. Dennis, man, don't do this. We work together. You know me. Dennis, they're coming for you next. Let me in, and I'll explain everything." I sat in the communications room, hands over my ears, waiting for morning. The voices grew angrier as the night wore on, hurling accusations and threats. But I never answered. I never opened the door. Rule 3: maintain radio contact during exterior operations. Since I wasn't going outside, this didn't apply directly, but I kept the radio on constantly anyway. The static a comforting reminder that I wasn't completely cut off from the world. Rule 4: do not approach figures who shouldn't be there. They appeared more frequently now, not just on distant ridges, but closer to the station. Sometimes I'd see Banks standing by the western sensor array, or Robertson near the main entrance. Once I saw Jackson pressed against the equipment bay window, his face distorted as if viewed through warped glass. I documented each sighting meticulously. Date, time, location, appearance. Sometimes they would stand motionless for hours. Other times they would pace back and forth or make gestures I couldn't interpret. And then, without warning, they would simply vanish, not walk away, but disappear between one blink and the next. Rule 5: do not look out windows after midnight. This was perhaps the most important rule of all. I covered every window before sunset each day, using the heavy blackout curtains designed for the Arctic summer. No matter what sounds I heard, tapping, scratching, voices calling my name, I never pulled back those curtains after dark. For 6 weeks, I maintained this routine. Wake up, check systems, document any unusual occurrences, prepare meals, maintain the station, cover windows before dark, ignore the knocking, try to sleep, repeat. The figures appeared more frequently as time passed. In the beginning, I might spot one every few days. By week 4, they were a daily occurrence. By week 6, I could see multiple figures at once, standing in a loose circle around the station, all of them looking inward. I took photographs when possible, though the images often came out blurry or distorted. In some, the figures appeared as nothing more than dark smudges against the white landscape. In others, they were clearer, human-shaped but wrong somehow, with proportions that didn't quite make sense. The nights were the worst. The knocking would start as soon as darkness fell, accompanied by voices that sounded exactly like my missing colleagues. Sometimes they would plead for help. Other times they would offer warnings about what was coming for me. And sometimes they would simply repeat my name, over and over for hours on end, but I never broke the rules. Not once in those 6 long weeks. And slowly, day by day, I began to understand that the rules weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were a survival manual, distilled to its most essential elements. Each one addressed a specific threat, a particular way the Arctic, or whatever lived in it, tried to claim those who ventured into its domain. As the day of my replacement's scheduled arrival drew near, the activity outside intensified. More figures appeared, standing closer to the station than ever before. The knocking at night became almost constant, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from every exterior wall simultaneously. But I held firm, counting down the hours until I would no longer be alone. I learned that replacement staff would arrive within days. The notification came through official channels, delivered with the same clinical efficiency as any other military communique. Lieutenant Gabriella Manning and Corporal Ethan Schneider. Those were the names I committed to memory, repeating them like a mantra that promised an end to my isolation. The night before their scheduled arrival was my final night of solitude. I went through my evening routine, checking systems, preparing a meal, documenting the day's occurrences, and, most importantly, covering every window with blackout curtains before the sun disappeared. The process had become automatic, my hands moving through the motions while my mind cataloged the increasing frequency of figure sightings around the station. I settled into the communications room with a mug of coffee, ready for what had become a nightly ordeal of unwanted visitors. Usually the knocking started around 11. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Tonight was different. The first knocks came at 9:30, earlier than ever before. The rhythm was familiar, but the intensity was not. The sound reverberated through the metal walls of the station, as if someone was using something harder than knuckles. I took a deep breath and focused on my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my hands. "Dennis, you in there, man?" Banks's voice called from the main entrance. "Hey, come on, open up. It's freezing out here." I didn't respond. That was part of the routine, too. No matter how real they sounded, no matter what they said, I never acknowledged them. "Barry, this is Robertson. Stop being an asshole and open the door. We've been out here for weeks." A third voice joined in, softer than the others, but unmistakably Jackson's. "Dennis, please. My fingers are turning black. I need medical attention." All 3 at once. That was new. Usually they took turns, one voice one night, another the next. I set my coffee down and pressed my palms against my ears, but it did little to muffle their pleas. "We can see you through the window, Dennis," Banks called, though all the curtains were drawn tight. "Just open up for a second. That's all we need." The knocking spread from the main entrance to the equipment bay door, then to the emergency exit, until it seemed to come from every exterior wall simultaneously. A coordinated assault of sound. "You're going to let us die out here?" Robertson's voice had taken on an edge I hadn't heard before. "After everything we've been through together?" "Dennis, I'm bleeding," Jackson whimpered. "Something got me. I need help." Their tactics were evolving. Before they'd cycle through pleas, reasoning, and anger. Tonight, they layered their approaches, one pleading while another accused, the third describing graphic injuries that made my stomach turn. "I thought we were friends," Banks said, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "I would have opened the door for you." "You're a coward," Robertson spat, "hiding in there while we suffer." "I can see my bones," Jackson moaned. "My skin is peeling off from frostbite." I moved to the center of the room, as far from any exterior wall as possible, and began reciting the 5 rules aloud. 1. Never leave alone. 2. Never open for knocking. 3. Maintain radio contact during exterior operations. 4. Do not approach figures who shouldn't be there. 5. Do not look out windows after midnight. The voices grew more frantic as the night wore on, their pleas more desperate, their accusations more personal. They knew things about me, my hometown, my family, details I'd mentioned to the real Banks or Jackson in casual conversation. They used this knowledge like weapons, trying to convince me they were really my missing colleagues. "Remember when you told me about your brother's accident?" Banks called. "How you still blame yourself. I'm the only one you told, Dennis. It's really me." That was true. I had told Banks about my brother during a late-night maintenance shift. The revelation made my heart race, but I clung to what I'd learned. These things, whatever they were, could access memories somehow. Maybe from the real Banks before he disappeared. Maybe from my own mind. Around 2 a.m, the tone changed completely. The voices became hostile, threatening. "We're going to get in eventually," Robertson growled. "And when we do, You'll wish you'd opened the door when we asked nicely. We know how to hurt you." Jackson's voice had lost all its previous weakness, now cold and calculating. "We know what you fear. There are more of us now," Banks added. "We're not alone anymore." The knocking turned to pounding, so hard that small items vibrated off shelves. I checked the security monitors repeatedly, but they showed nothing. No movement, no figures, just empty snow reflecting moonlight. Yet the sounds continued. Impossibly loud, impossibly coordinated. I didn't sleep. By dawn, the voices and knocking had stopped, as they always did when daylight returned. I made a fresh pot of coffee and waited until the sun was fully up before beginning my morning checks. When I finally looked at the exterior cameras, I saw something new. Messages in the snow. Large letters carved or pressed into the white surface, forming words in a rough circle around the entire station. I switched from camera to camera, reading the fragments. "Why won't you help us? We are real. It's really us, Dennis. They took our forms, but not our minds. Open the door. We're still alive out here." The messages extended in all directions, some small enough to fit in a single camera frame, others stretching dozens of feet. I grabbed the station's digital camera and took photos through each window, careful not to step outside. Rule 1. Never leave alone. Even with replacements coming today, I wouldn't break it. The messages looked freshly made with crisp edges not yet softened by wind. Some appeared to have been written with a finger or stick. Others seemed pressed into the snow by something larger, perhaps a body being dragged. That thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. I spent the morning documenting everything, adding the photos to my growing file of evidence. Part of me wanted to investigate the messages up close, to see if there were footprints or other signs of who or what had created them. But Rule 4 kept me inside. Do not approach figures who shouldn't be there, and nothing should be out there making messages in the snow. The station felt different that day, as if the walls had thinned overnight. I kept the radio on for company, the static a reminder that the outside world still existed. Around noon, I heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors growing steadily louder. I watched through the main entrance window as the transport helicopter descended onto the landing pad 50 yards from the station. 2 figures disembarked, carrying duffel bags and ducking under the still spinning rotors. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of military personnel, heading directly for the entrance. I opened the door, the first time I'd done so for a knock in 6 weeks, after confirming through the window that they were indeed human arrivals, not the mimics that had haunted the perimeter. Lieutenant Gabriella Manning entered first, removing her hood to reveal dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She saluted crisply. "Sergeant Barry, Lieutenant Gabriella Manning reporting for duty, sir." Behind her, Corporal Ethan Schneider nodded a greeting, his broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway. "Welcome to Arctic Research Station Delta 7, I said, my voice sounding strange to my ears after weeks of minimal use. "Please come in quickly and secure the door." They exchanged a glance at my urgency, but complied. Once inside, I led them to the common area where I'd prepared coffee and laid out the station schematics. "Before anything else," I began, "there are 5 rules you need to know." I pulled out my own laminated card, now worn at the edges from constant handling. These rules are not suggestions. They're not guidelines. They are the difference between survival and disappearance. Manning sat up straighter, her amber eyes focused intently on the card. "We were briefed about some special protocols for this station, but not specifics." "The briefing won't have covered this," I said. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, maybe even crazy. But I need you to understand that following these rules kept me alive when 3 others disappeared." I explained each rule in detail, recounting what had happened to Banks, Robertson, and Jackson when they broke them. I described the figures that appeared outside, the knocking at night, the voices that knew things they shouldn't know. I showed them my documentation, the logs, the blurry photos, the recordings of knocking patterns, and finally, the pictures I'd taken that morning of the messages in the snow. "This was just a few hours ago," I said, passing the camera to Manning. "They've never left messages before." She scrolled through the images, her expression remaining professionally neutral, but I noticed her swallow hard at the photo showing we're still alive out here. "And you've been alone here for 6 weeks?" Schneider asked, leaning forward to look at the camera screen. "Yes." "The knocking started the first night. The figures appeared a few days later. It's been escalating ever since." "Have you considered—" Schneider began, but Manning cut him off with a subtle hand gesture. "We understand the gravity of the situation, Sergeant," she said. "These rules will be followed without exception." She turned to Schneider. "Is that clear, Corporal?" "Yes, Lieutenant," he replied, though I caught a flicker of skepticism in his eyes. The same look I'd had when Commander Bradley first handed me the rule card. "You don't believe me," I said to Schneider. "That's normal. Banks didn't. Robertson didn't. Even I didn't at first. But you will." I pointed to the window where the messages were still visible in the snow. "They're waiting for someone to break the rules again." "I believe that you believe it, sir," Schneider said carefully. "And I'll follow the protocols." "Good," I replied. "Because whatever's out there, it's patient, it can wait, it learns and adapts. The knocking used to be simple. Now they use voices, memories, and written messages. They're getting better at mimicking humanity." Manning took the rule card from my hand, reading each item again. "Never leave alone. Never open for knocking. Maintain radio contact during exterior operations. Do not approach figures who shouldn't be there. Do not look out windows after midnight." She looked up at me. "Simple enough to remember." "Simple to remember, critical to follow," I said. "No exceptions, no matter what you hear or see. No matter who it sounds like or what they say they need, no matter what appears in the snow or how convincing it seems." They nodded, and I continued with the standard station briefing. Systems operations, maintenance schedules, communication protocols. But throughout the technical discussion, I kept returning to the rules, drilling them into my replacements with the fervor of someone who had seen the consequences of breaking them. "Cover all windows before dark," I emphasized. "Even a quick glance after midnight can change everything." Jackson looked once, just once, and within days, he was gone. Manning assured me they understood, her tone respectful rather than humoring. Schneider's skepticism seemed to waver as I showed him the station logs documenting the increasing frequency of incidents. "One last thing," I said as we finished the briefing. "They know when you're new. They'll test you, try to find weaknesses. The first few nights will be the hardest." "We'll be ready," Manning said. I hoped she was right, because as much as I'd told them, as much evidence as I'd presented, they couldn't truly understand until they'd heard the voices themselves. Voices that knew things they shouldn't. Voices that belonged to people who no longer existed, at least not in any form we could comprehend. I left Arctic Research Station Delta 7 the following morning. The helicopter arrived just after dawn, its rotors slicing through the crisp air as it descended onto the landing pad 50 yards from the main entrance. Lieutenant Manning and Corporal Schneider stood with me at the doorway, their faces showing a mix of concern and relief. Concern for what they would face in the coming weeks. Relief that they wouldn't be starting their assignment alone. "Remember, no exceptions to the rules," I said, raising my voice over the helicopter's approach. "Not for any reason." Manning nodded firmly. "We've got this, Barry. Safe travels." Schneider gave me a tight smile and a salute that seemed more genuine than any of his previous gestures. Perhaps my documentation had finally convinced him. I tucked the laminated rules card into my breast pocket rather than leaving it behind. The card had become worn at the edges from constant handling, the plastic coating slightly clouded from my fingerprints. I hadn't planned to take it. There were other copies at the station, but something made me want to keep this small reminder of what I'd experienced. The pilot gave me a casual nod as I climbed aboard, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I took one last look at the station, its metal walls gleaming in the morning light, windows once again uncovered for the day, before the helicopter lifted off. Manning and Schneider grew smaller below us, two tiny figures standing side by side in the vast white expanse. As we gained altitude, I noticed something in the snow that hadn't been visible from ground level, faint, almost imperceptible lines stretching outward from the station in all directions. They might have been nothing more than wind patterns in the snow, but their radiating arrangement reminded me uncomfortably of the messages I'd documented just yesterday. The pilot didn't speak much during our flight, which suited me fine. I spent most of the journey staring out the window at the endless white landscape below, thinking about Banks, Robertson, and Jackson. What had happened to them out there in that frozen emptiness? Had they truly vanished? Or were they somehow still present in some form I couldn't comprehend? I never saw their bodies, never found any concrete evidence of what took them. Just those figures with their wrong proportions and flat features. Those voices that knew things they shouldn't know. And those messages carved in the snow. The Arctic held dangers beyond the obvious threats of cold, isolation, and treacherous weather. Dangers I still couldn't name or explain, but had learned to respect. The rules had saved me. 5 simple directives that had seemed arbitrary and even silly when I first arrived had provided the structure that kept me from suffering whatever fate had befallen my predecessors. Never leave alone. Never open for knocking. Maintain radio contact during exterior operations. Don't approach figures who shouldn't be there. Don't look out windows after midnight. When we landed at headquarters, I was met by a debriefing team eager to hear about my extended solo assignment. I filed a comprehensive report detailing everything I'd witnessed and experienced, including copies of my documentation and photographs. I emphasized the psychological impact of Arctic isolation, particularly the effects of extended solitude, and strongly recommended more frequent staff rotations to avoid solo assignments altogether. We need to study this phenomenon more carefully, I told the senior officer reviewing my report. Whatever's happening at Delta 7 goes beyond standard Arctic hallucinations or isolation psychosis. He nodded politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the same look Schneider had given me before seeing my evidence. We'll take your recommendations under advisement, Sergeant Barry. I returned to regular military routine within days. My commanding officers assigned me to training exercises and standard missions, apparently satisfied that I had readjusted well. But I hadn't readjusted. Not completely. Certain habits followed me from the station, becoming part of my daily life. I maintained radio contact during every mission, checking in more frequently than protocol required. I kept my back to walls whenever possible, maintaining clear sightlines to all doors and windows. I grew wary of unexpected encounters, especially in isolated areas, finding myself scanning faces for signs of wrongness or flatness. And most critically, I never looked out windows after midnight, regardless of what sounds I might hear outside. In my apartment on base, I installed blackout curtains in every room, drawing them closed each evening before sunset as automatically as I had at the station. Some nights, lying awake in bed, I imagined I heard faint tapping on the glass. 3 taps, pause, 3 more, but I never checked. Never pulled back the curtain, not even an inch. Sometimes I took out the laminated rules card and ran my thumb over its surface, remembering the voices of Banks, Robertson, and Jackson calling my name through the Arctic night.